Hello and welcome back. This is the week 7 lecture. So today we are talking about chapter 5 in the book, and we are moving into our next critical approach or critical school. So we've spent the last couple of weeks with formalism. We are probably ready for something new, so that's good news. Today we're talking about what the book calls literature and linguistics. That's a rather broad title. What we are really talking about in this chapter are two different critical schools that are related. One sort of comes as a response to the other, but we are going to deal with them separately. So the first is structuralism. And this should sound somewhat familiar. We've been talking about structure a lot. We've been talking about the importance of the structure of literary texts. So now we're dealing even more with that. We are thinking about structuralism first, and then we'll talk about post-structuralism, also called deconstruction. Okay, so these are two different schools that develop really around the middle of the 20th century, at least with structuralism, and then post-structuralism really becomes more popular like in the 60s and 70s. They're both still around. They are both critical schools that we can use, that we can utilize to help us analyze texts. I think we might find them a little bit difficult in some ways, but I think this will be useful because these two critical approaches really sort of require us to take a different perspective on certain texts. This is going to sort of force us to read in a little bit of a different way. This will allow us to look for some different things. This might expand our repertoire a little bit, give us more options, give us more tools that we can potentially use when we analyze in the future. So let's start with structuralism, then we'll talk about post-structuralism, which of course comes after. All right, so let's start with the book's title, because I just want to think a little bit more about what they mean when they say that these approaches are really all about the combination of literature and linguistics. Now, many of you might be familiar with linguistics as an academic discipline, as a specific field of study. But if you are not familiar, let me just give you a very quick definition, which might help us to understand kind of what structuralism and post-structuralism are doing. So linguistics is usually thought to be separate from the academic discipline of English and certainly separate from literary study. So here's a basic definition for linguistics. It is the scientific study of language and its structures. Now, there's more to it than that, but for our purposes, we can just work with that very basic definition. But pay attention to the wording. The scientific study of language and its structures. So that word scientific should let you know that we are kind of moving away from the traditional domain of English class, because linguistics really does have a lot in common with social science and even in some cases hard sciences. They are doing a type of language study that we don't really do in typical English classes. We certainly don't do it in English 101 or 102, and we don't do it in here in English 203. So if you wanted to pursue linguistics, that would really be sort of a separate area of study. You know, big universities will have separate linguistic departments. Now, sometimes they might be housed near or in the English department. But take it from me, I was in a big English department that sort of included the linguists, but they were very separate from us, as they would have been the first to tell you. They viewed the work that they did as very different from the work that we did. They had different training, different backgrounds. Most of them, again, were sort of more similar to sociologists, anthropologists than they were to literary scholars. So I just wanted to start with that so you guys understand that linguistics is different from literary study. It's different. It's fundamentally different. And as literature students, we're not really expected to have a great knowledge of linguistics. Now, some of you might take some linguistics classes at some future point. If you end up being an English major here or elsewhere, there might be a class or two that you have to take related to linguistics, but it is a separate discipline. So I want us to know that, because what we need to understand this week and on some future weeks with some future critical approaches, because this is common in literary criticism, we have to understand that a lot of these principles and ideas that we use in literary criticism will come from other disciplines. They are not all unique or native to the study of lit. And that's very true with structuralism. So, as they explain in the book, structuralism was really developed by social scientists, and it was used primarily to study cultures and certain patterns or recurring structures that we can find in cultural formations, or different things that sort of provide order to everyday life for people in different cultures. So it is important to keep that in mind. Structuralism was not developed originally with the specific intention of using it to study literature. So structuralism has existed for a long time, but it's only within the last century or so that we've had a lot of scholars use it and apply it to literature. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So they are very indebted to linguistics and other disciplines. Let's start there. So when we use the principles of structuralism in literary criticism, we have to sort of adapt it a little bit, to our particular field. So when we do this kind of work, when we use the structuralist concepts to study literature, we're going to be doing something that looks a lot different from the formalist approach of last week. Because structuralists typically don't really care very much about what we would consider the sort of traditional narrative elements that we've been thinking about. So they didn't care very much about plot or character or setting or even theme. They weren't really looking for those types of elements. Instead, they were really focusing on linguistic structure. So in some cases, this might translate to us as grammatical structure. They could be very interested in grammar. They would also be interested in individual words. So we might think of this as diction or discourse. We'll talk about some of those ideas later, but they're very interested in how words function, and really how languages function as systems of meaning. So a lot of this might sound a little bit strange at first, but if we think more about it, it will make sense. So they're interested in structures of language, not only language, but for us, we're mostly thinking about language when we apply this stuff to literature. But they want to identify structures and relationships that provide meaning and sort of organize things, create hierarchies, create systems that humans follow. And this is important for a lot of aspects of human life. So they're often looking for what they would call signs. Now, in many cases, signs can just be individual words, right? But they're thinking about signs and how they communicate meaning. And they're thinking about other stuff too that we might not really deal with as much in here, but they're thinking about different signs and different systems that create meaning. And in this particular context, we can really focus on language. And they're interested in linguistic structure. So the linguistic structure of a literary text is something that we can look for, identify, and analyze. But we're going to have to move away from those traditional, literary elements, and we're going to have to start thinking about other ways to really approach a literary text, a more linguistic way, a way that is more based on language and individual words. So, again, very different from what the formalists were doing. Structuralists were not really looking for that correct interpretation of a text. That was very important to formalists. And really, in a lot of ways, structuralists aren't really putting that much privilege or authority within the text itself. To them, literary texts are a lot like a lot of other cultural or social phenomena. So, language, landscaping, architecture, what they would have described as kinship, like different family relationships, marriage customs, fashion, politics. To them, all of those are cultural and social phenomenon that can be studied and analyzed. So, literary texts are another thing that can be studied and analyzed. They are important cultural items, right? These are all different cultural items that can be sort of understood as systems. They are systems with meanings and signs that communicate those meanings. And these are systems that we might not think about very much. We might not think about politics very much if we're not political. We might not think about fashion very much if we don't think that we are interested in that particular cultural area. But the rules that go along with all of these systems really help to govern our lives. Even if we don't think a lot about language, we use it all the time. Even if we don't think about fashion, we still buy clothes, we wear clothes. So, in some ways, we are making certain decisions based on a system of fashion that has a meaning, that multiple meanings, has different signs, different structures, and it goes for anything else. Architecture, there's other examples that I didn't write down, but in particular, structuralists were interested in kinship and marriage customs because they were studying a lot of other cultures and how those cultures were organized into systems, into structures. And they determined that family relationships and the way people, dated and married had a lot to do with like the organization of people's lives and even values. So again, kind of abstract. We're not going to be doing all of that sort of work, but this is where structuralists were coming from. So again, for them, literary texts were just another way to study a particular system, a particular structure, which in this case would be language. So again, not really designed for literature, but it works well for literature because obviously we are interested in language anytime we are analyzing literature. So let's go over a couple of important terms, some language that we need to understand if we're going to use the structuralist approach. And this is kind of interesting. If you guys can just bear with me, it might feel a little bit strange and we are getting some French words here, but just bear with me a little bit because I think this will start making sense to you very soon. So we get a lot of these key structuralist concepts from this guy, Ferdinand de Saussure, right, who is a Swiss linguist, and he really helped to introduce a lot of these structuralist concepts to a larger audience. So Saussure helped us to kind of understand this basic relationship that I really want us to keep in mind when we are using structuralism. Okay, so let's start with a couple of terms. First, what he would have referred to as la langue, which really just translates to language. Okay, Saussure spoke French. He was Swiss, a French-speaking Swiss person, so he's using French terms, but we can come up with easy translations for these. So, la langue is just a language, and a language is a system shared by a bunch of different people. All the different members of that language system or that language community, they share certain things. And I think we can understand this. We are all English speakers. Even if English was not the first language for all of us, we all speak it. We all read it. we all understand it, and we all, write in English. We might write in other languages too. We might possess mastery of other languages. So you guys might belong to multiple language communities. And that's very interesting. That gives you a lot of potential to move around and do different things as an analyzer. But for now, we can just think about the fact that we all belong to a language community. We are all members of the English language community. All right. So that's all he means by la langue. It's a language, and a language is a system, just like a lot of other systems that we have in various cultures. Then we have la parole, which translates to a word. Okay. Any individual word, or really any specific application of a language in a particular speech or writing task. But for us, really, when we're thinking of la parole, we're thinking about individual words. Individual words are individual instances or examples of a language, right? So we have a large language system that we all share. And then within that language system, we have individual words that do different things and express different meanings. But since we are all members of the English language community, we're mostly going to be able to use and understand a lot of the same words. That's what makes language function. Right? That's what makes language intelligible. We all share certain knowledge. We all know a lot of the same words. We all use a lot of the same words. And that's how we're able to understand each other. Right? That's how all members of a particular language community can understand each other, can express themselves to one another. Of course, it becomes a lot more difficult when you have one person from one language community trying to talk to somebody from a different language community, because they don't share words, they don't share knowledge, they don't share meaning in the same way. So, of course, if you are, like I said, if you're a member of multiple language communities, you can sort of move back and forth. But if you only belong to one language community, you're not really going to have a great ability to understand people from other language communities. So oftentimes things are only intelligible to people within the same language community because we share knowledge, we use the same conventions, right? We've all been taught a lot of the same stuff as children, so we can communicate, all right, using individual words. But now let's think a little bit more about those paroles, those individual words. So typically words will appear to us in one of two ways. They will appear phonetically, which means they will come up in speech, right? You might hear somebody say a word, right? So that's one way to experience it. And of course, the other common way to experience a word is to read it. If you are reading something, you will, of course, come across many different individual words. So that would be a semantic event, right? If you're hearing the word, that's phonetic. If you are reading the word, that's semantic. But either way, we are relying on these words. And we can also call these words signs, right? Because for a structuralist, a sign is anything that can convey meaning. A sign is showing us something, telling us something, right? Referencing something else. So a sign can be anything, but when we're doing structuralism with lit, obviously most signs will be individual words, those individual paroles. So most of these words or signs will sort of take the form of a two-part sort of mental unit. And they call this, I think, a mental or linguistic unit because a lot of this is happening inside your head. And a lot of this is almost unconscious. It happens so quickly, you might not notice that it's actually a two-part process. Okay? But just imagine this for a moment. You are reading something, all right? And you come across the word tree. Tree. So this is a semantic experience for you. You are reading, and as soon as you land on that word, as soon as you see those four letters, okay, you are immediately experiencing what we call the signifier. All right, this is the first part of the two-part sign that we experience when we're listening or reading something. Okay, so when you read the word tree, the actual letters, the actual word itself, as it appears on the page, that is what's called a signifier, right? So that is the sound or the image that a word makes. So that's what it sounds like if you hear it, and that's what it looks like if you read it. All right, so as soon as you hear or read that word tree, you're consuming the signifier without even really thinking about it because you already know what the word tree means. And that's the second part. Okay, so the first part of the sign is the signifier, right? That's the word itself. And then the second part is what we call the signified. That's the actual meaning of the word or the concept that it represents. So these are really two separate things. The sign is the word on the page. The signifier is the word on the page. The signified is what that word actually means. But we process all of this so quickly, we often don't notice that it really is a two-step process. So first, you see the word tree, and then automatically you think about what that word actually means. So almost unconsciously, you go from the signifier to the signified. You don't even really have to think about it, at least not very often, at least not with simple words that you already know. Now, of course, if you come across a word that you don't know, you might be able to recognize the signifier, but you don't know the signified. You don't know what it means. You don't know what it represents. Maybe you can read the word, you can pronounce the word, but that's only half of the sign. You don't know what the word actually means, so you have to look it up. In those cases, you can kind of tell that this does require effort sometimes, that there is a move that you have to make to get from the signifier to the signified. But usually this happens very quickly for us because we know a lot of words. And the vast majority of words that we read, typically we already know them, right? So we don't have to look them up. So as soon as you see or hear the word tree, already in your mind, you have an image of what a tree looks like, right? You immediately know what that signifier is signifying, right? You know what it means. You know the concept that it's trying to represent. So that's a two-step process that we often overlook. We don't think about it very much, right? We see the signifier, we automatically know what it signifies, and then we move on. But this is actually a very interesting relationship. You know, for most of us, the signifier and the signified are inseparable. We cannot have one without the other. But if we think about it more, and one of the big points that Saussure makes is that there is really no inherent or natural connection between a signifier and then the signified, what it actually means. He says this is all kind of manufactured. It's all artificial, right? It's all part of a language system that was developed by people, right? So languages don't exist in nature. People have to create language. People have to make rules that govern the use of language. So Saussure is saying, really, if you think about it, there's nothing in that word tree that automatically should or would make you think of a tree growing outside. There's nothing in those letters, really. There's nothing natural in the way the word sounds or the way the word looks that would automatically create the meaning of that word, the meaning that we know. And if you want evidence of that, just look at the fact that there are other words for the same concept. Just think about all the different languages that exist in the world. Every language in the world has a word or multiple words for tree, right? But all of those words are different. They all have different letters. They all make different sounds, right? They're different lengths. So there's no one natural signifier that will always mean and always represent tree. There's just not. If it worked like that, we would only have one language. And obviously, that's not the case. So, if you think about it that way, you can see that Saussure right. There's nothing natural about the word tree that would make you think of what we know of as a tree. It's just that we've been taught to associate the signifier with that particular signification, that particular meaning. We were all taught the word. We were all taught what it means when we were very small children, right? So we don't think about it. And because we are members of the same language community, we hear other people use that word. We see that word all the time. So we don't question it. Yeah, when I hear that word, I know what we're talking about. When I read that word, I have a mental image of what a tree looks like. But the point is, this relationship between signifier and signified is artificial. It's human made. It does not occur naturally in nature, right? And it only makes sense within a specific language system. So again, this relationship between the word tree and a tall, leafy, shrub-like thing that grows out of the earth, right? That only makes sense in English. That only makes sense in our particular language system. If we went to a different language system, we would have a different signifier that led us to the same meaning, right? In other words, we would just have a different word that means the same thing. So that shows that there is a certain arbitrary nature to the relationships between words and their meanings. And if you want, that's how you can really think about this. A signifier is the word, and then the signified is the meaning. So the relationship between a word and what it means is really just a product of a language system. It is a structure. It's often a rule that's been taught to us, but it's not a natural thing that has to always be the same. And again, some people will experiment with this and say we could easily use a different word that means tree. We could replace tree with a different word that sounds different with different letters. But as long as everybody in the language community learned that this new word means what tree used to mean, then we're going to be fine. We're going to be able to still communicate and there won't be that much confusion. If you want a good example of this and another example of how language changes over time, think of the word Google. Okay, just think of that word and how common it is today. We use the word all the time. It can also be a noun or a verb. So we can talk about Googling something, right? That is an action that we can perform online. But we could also talk about Google as a noun, as a search engine, or even as a company that exists, in the world. And just remember that 20, or I guess maybe 30 years ago, nobody knew what that word was. Nobody knew what Google was. It didn't exist yet as a noun or a verb. But now it does. So now if you read or hear that signifier, if you see the word Google, you immediately know what the meaning is. Right? You immediately know that we're talking about a popular internet search engine, or we're talking about the action of searching for something on that search engine. You know that. You automatically know that. But just remember how sort of arbitrary that word is. The signifier could change, and we could still have the same meaning. Right? And just remember that there used to be a lot of other search engines. Back in the 90s, there was still kind of an open question as to which search engine would become dominant. And the answer, obviously, we know now, was Google. But what if, Bing or one of these other search engines like Internet Explorer, which I remember from my childhood, what if one of those had become more popular than Google, right? Well, then we would have a different signifier. We would say, hey, Bing that. Let's go and Bing something online, and we would know what that meant. That would mean the same thing that Google means now. Right? But the signifier is sort of interchangeable in some ways, right? We could replace one signifier with another. And as long as we're still teaching everybody in the language community that this signifier means this, then people are going to understand, right? So maybe we've never really thought about it that way, but it's true. That is true of language, and it's true of that sort of interesting relationship between words and what those words actually mean. So a lot of structuralist and post-structuralist work gets done at this level, at the level of relationship between the word and its meaning. And we're going to find that sometimes that relationship can be sort of volatile. It can be unpredictable. It can be a little bit different from what we might expect. So hopefully that makes sense. You guys can probably find more on this online and maybe some helpful explainer videos if I'm not really communicating well enough. But and I know the book can be difficult when you're trying to get these concepts. So I'm moving quickly, not always giving you the maximum amount of nuance, but hopefully this does help. And another thing to remember here with this sort of structuralist approach, like I said, for them, literary texts are just particular structures that exist within a larger language structure. So by understanding things about the literary text, they thought that we could understand larger things about language systems and about how people use language systems. So again, structuralists weren't always interested in literature for literature's sake. They thought studying literature, studying texts, could help us understand more about the structures and patterns that govern certain language systems. And structuralism can help us to understand those language systems based on certain structures that we might be able to identify in a literary text. So that's sort of what Saussure and some of those early structuralists gave us. They gave us these techniques, these strategies that we could apply to literature. So on page 170 of the book, in chapter 5, they talk about this guy, Roman Jakobson, and how he was sort of an important figure because he took a lot of these structuralist concepts and sort of made them more applicable to literature. And we're not going to get too deeply into Jacobson, but I just wanted to run through like the 6 key terms that he developed when it came to like finding some of these structures in lit, because you can use some of these terms. Even if you don't read Jacobson, we can use these terms to help us better understand certain structures and certain things that authors are doing in these works of literature to express meaning. This is kind of fun, so I just wanted to spend a moment on this. So we start with a sender. This will usually be an author if we're talking about a literary text, right? So the sender makes contact with a receiver. That's how we start. But let's break this down. The sender can be an author, all right? And when they make contact, that means that they are writing something, okay? So sender equals author. The contact equals a novel or a poem or a short story, and then the receiver is the audience, right? The receiver would just be a typical reader or a group of readers. So they are receiving the thing that the sender is giving them, right? So the sender is contacting the receiver in order to send a message, right? We can think of the message as the meaning or the larger thematic content, right? And they are sending that message using context and code. So let's think about those final 2 terms. We know what context means, maybe historical context, maybe understanding more about the subject matter that the literature is addressing, the sort of stuff that we largely avoided with formalism, but there could be some relevant context, particularly on the level of language, that we might need to consider. And then there's the code. So what exactly do they mean by code? Well, that's just certain structures that work within a language system. All right. So we can think about these different elements. So the six that Jacobson really wants to talk about is sender, contact, receiver, message, context, and then code. So we can really think of the transmission of a literary text this way. A sender is contacting an audience in order to provide a message using both context and certain language codes. Language codes that the audience, those receivers, will be able to understand, but there might be a deeper level to those codes that we, as the analysts, can uncover and talk about. So, just another way to think about structures, particularly structures of language, and how they might be operating in literary texts. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead. We don't have to talk about the Russian formalists. That's just too much, I think, for 1 week. But let's jump down and talk a little bit about Claude Levi Strauss and sort of another branch of structuralism that's still very influential for us today. So, Levi Strauss was a cultural anthropologist. He was a social scientist studying culture, not necessarily studying literary text specifically, but he got very interested in myths and other sort of linguistic structures, right? They're based in language that help to organize human societies in different cultures. I believe he studied a particular Native American group in Brazil, and he studied some other cultures, but he noticed that there were all these different systems that really helped to sort of organize their lives. This is true of any sort, any society, any culture. So, like we were saying, language is one of those systems, marriage, family relations, work relations, all of those things, the people's jobs, their relationships to their bosses, all of those are systems, right? And they all matter. So we could study any of them if we wanted to do what Levi Strauss was doing, but we're particularly interested, obviously, in the language part. So he was interested in how myths did a lot of work within language systems, but also even beyond language systems. He realized that a lot of the myths or the stories that different cultures told, they did a lot of other work in those societies. They helped to organize value systems. They created hierarchies. They did a lot of things that humans typically do when we're trying to live together in organized societies. So a few of the things that Levi Strauss studied would be like the structures of riddles or fables, the kinds of tales that might get handed down, might be told orally or written down, but also specific myths that often showed up in different cultures, like the Oedipus myth, or different Native American myths that we can find in Native American cultures in North America, or the Grail cycle, which is like a series of King Arthur stories from like the 13th century. So he was noticing structures in all of these different myths or these different types of narratives. He was finding patterns in structures. And ultimately, he realized that myths almost work like languages of their own. They're almost like self-contained language systems that help us to organize our lives. They help to teach us right from wrong. They help us to understand what matters, what's important in our culture, right? So he's saying, yeah, it's a language system, but it's a language system that has a lot more importance. It's beyond just people speaking. It has a lot to do with how people see themselves, how they see their own community, how they relate to others, right? So again, we don't have to get too deep into that, but that's where a lot of the structuralist work comes from. Studying these kinds of structures, these kinds of language systems, and figuring out, okay, what are they doing? Why do they matter? But in order to understand the larger language system of mythology, he had to study individual specific myths. So we could sort of compare that to what we might do in literary study. In order to learn more about our language system, we can study individual literary texts and look for structures, patterns, and meanings. So those guys give us structuralism. We adapt structuralism for a more literary climate, and we can still use it to this day. All right, so we can talk a little bit about French structuralism and some of their key terms. A lot of the guys that were associated with French structuralism would later be associated with what came after structuralism, which we sometimes call post-structuralism or deconstruction. We'll get to that in a moment. But the French structuralist accepted a lot of the basic ideas from the original structuralist, from Saussure and Levi Strauss. They accepted that basic approach to texts. And they made it a little bit more explicit. So for them, a particular narrative, a particular literary text was comparable to an individual sentence, right? Within that sentence, there are different parts that can be identified and analyzed. And we still very much use that frame when we approach literary text. So for them, a literary text was like an individual sentence within a larger language system, right? Or within a larger speech or writing event, right? So a literary text is one example of the larger language. And we can study that text in order to arrive at a better understanding of the language system. So they came up with a few more terms that we still use that we think are pretty important. So again, these are French terms that we can translate. So they talked about histoire, which for us really just means a narrative. But borrowing a lot from Levi Strauss, they determined that in any given culture, there are a lot of already established narratives that have existed for a long time. Often they might exist in the realm of mythology. They also exist in older narratives. So what they're kind of getting at is there's only so many narratives that can exist within a culture. There's only or within a language system, right? A culture that uses one particular language system. There's only so many narratives. So a narrative for them was just a sequence of events, right? And there were a lot of cultural narratives that we could identify in a particular place by studying their mythology, their history, traditional texts that were still popular. So they said, okay, there's a certain number of narratives out there, and a lot of them are getting sort of recycled or reworked. And if we think about that, we might decide it's still kind of true, right? There are a lot of really popular types of narratives that have existed really as long as literature has. The hero's journey is one that you might be familiar with. There's so many examples of that, right? A hero, whether it's a willing hero or an unwilling hero, a typical hero or a surprising hero, they go on a quest, they have to accomplish a goal, they have to help people, save somebody, find something, accomplish something, right? And that's what the story is based on. We've talked before about the coming of age story, right? A very common narrative in a lot of different societies over time, right? The story of a young person growing up, learning about adult life, going through various milestones pertaining to love and careers and family. These are narratives that exist throughout time. So that's kind of what they're getting at with this idea of histoire, or like the actual just like basic narrative itself. And then we have discourse. All right. Discourse is what authors do with those classic familiar narratives. So a discourse is when an author rearranges or restructures a narrative for their own artistic reasons, right? So when we get a new superhero movie that's basically just another version of the hero's journey, right, we're getting a particular discourse. right? So when we watch a Spider-Man movie, it's kind of the same narrative that we've had for thousands of years, but now we have a particular discourse. Now we have an author or a filmmaker who is rearranging that basic narrative, sort of remaking it in order to create something new, a new discourse. And they're doing that, obviously, to make money, but also to create art. So discourses are created by authors or maybe even by narrators, the people that are actually delivering the stories, delivering these specific narratives. So I hope that makes sense. We have sort of dominant narratives. We can call them cultural narratives, classical narratives, and then we can rework them into specific discourses. All right. And then when we're studying literature, we're often going to find a lot of what they call discursive manipulation. So that sounds complicated, but it's really not. It really just refers to all the stuff an author does when they're creating their own discourse. Right? So this consists of all the flashbacks that the author uses in a particular narrative, their treatment of time, the way they explain things, shifts in viewpoint, shifts in that narrative point of view. Think about Frankenstein, right? Think about the fact that we hear from three different narrators in that novel. The basic narrative of Frankenstein is actually been around for a while. A human trying to accomplish things that humans really shouldn't accomplish. That narrative has been around for a long time. Sort of making a bargain, making a bad deal so you can find forbidden knowledge, but maybe losing your humanity, losing people close to you in the process. That narrative's been around. It's in Dr. Faustus. It's in a lot of earlier works. It's common enough. Shelley didn't necessarily create that entire narrative. She created a particular discourse. She took that classic narrative and she manipulated it to suit her own purposes. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what all literary authors do. She inserted different techniques, different literary elements. She made Victor not super sympathetic. She made the creature somewhat sympathetic. She allowed the creature to tell his own story for several chapters. She provided a frame narrative with Walton. See, all of that is discursive manipulation. She could have told the narrative in a more straightforward fashion if she really wanted to, right? But by adding Walton, by adding the creature's narration, she is manipulating point of view. She is providing multiple narrators who often sort of contradict each other. At least that's true with the creature and Victor, right? They don't agree with what the other one is saying oftentimes. So that creates a weird effect for readers. This is sometimes referred to as defamiliarization. So again, these narratives are common to anybody in the culture, anybody in the language community. We've heard some version of that narrative before, but we're not as familiar with the particular discursive manipulation that Shelley is going to be doing. So we might be surprised by certain things that we find in the novel. We're not surprised by the basic narrative. We already know it. We're surprised by Shelley's discourse, the way she's organizing time, the way she's describing characters, and the way that she's presenting point of view. So all authors do this, right? Every author is going to create their own discourse, their own version of popular dominant narratives that already exist. So this is how the French structuralists really approached literary texts. So they were looking for codes and conventions. Again, going back to that idea of code, that means sort of like these formal structures native to a language system. And they were saying, as members of that language system, we internalize a lot of these codes. We recognize the codes, we use the codes, but we might not always think very much about the codes, kind of like that relationship between the signifier and the signified. It all seems to happen so fast in our minds, we don't really think very much about what's going on. But these guys were saying, in order for any literary text to communicate meaning, it has to use language conventions that people understand, and it has to use codes that are really based on the formal structure of language. And that formal structure will explain whatever is being explained, right? If you don't know the codes, you're not going to understand the meaning. You're not going to understand the message that the author is trying to deliver through their discourse or through different discourses that might be on display in the text. So I know it's a little complicated, but that's kind of the point. Also, as we move into post-structuralism and what is sometimes called deconstruction, that's kind of the point that a lot of the scholars and critics were making. They're saying literature is complicated. Literature and language, in particular, is weird. Language is complicated. Language does not always have stable meanings. We would like for it to, because that makes it easier for us. But we have to navigate some of these breaks or some of these moments where, yeah, we're almost being defamiliarized. We're almost being alienated from the text because we might not recognize something in the discourse, or we might not understand a certain language code. So all of that stuff was interesting to them, and it was worth further analysis. So again, they're looking for features that are like patterns, recurring features that are really going back to structures of language. So they're trying to find those patterns, those structures, and they want to talk about them. So like the formalists, they didn't care all that much about the authors. They didn't think it was really important to talk about authors very much. We could talk about discursive manipulation because that's what the author is doing. But these guys would have said, really, that's all authorship is. All authors do is just rearrange pre-existing structures, pre-existing codes that people in the language community already know. Kind of like we already know those dominant narratives. We've heard them before. They get translated into children's stories, myths, fables. We all know them. We all know the codes of the language, right? So authors are just playing around with all of that stuff that already exists. The narratives already exist, and those language structures and codes already exist. So the authors are just moving them around, rearranging them, doing different things with them, but they're not necessarily inventing that stuff. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about authorship. Again, you don't have to ignore the author entirely, but if you follow their logic, we don't have to care very much, obviously, about like the author's life. We're just thinking about how the author is manipulating their discourse in order to communicate certain codes and meanings. So always bringing it back to the nuts and bolts of language and what language is really doing. So again, to go back to that word parole, right, an individual word, we can also think of themes or messages as kind of functioning like paroles, right? And you can only understand a word if you understand the language, right? You can only understand the meaning of a literary text if you understand the codes that govern that language. So it's kind of the same thing. Right? So for structuralists, reading really is a quest for understanding the codes that language systems rely on. But they're going to discover that those codes can change. Again, we like to think of language as being really stable. Right? Language is stable. It means the same thing tomorrow as it meant yesterday. But what the post-structuralists tell us is that that's not always the case, right? A lot of language is actually sort of unstable. Again, those relationships between words and the meanings of the words, those relationships can change over time. They can be unstable. They can sort of be different for different people. So there's a lot of gray area And that's really where the post structuralists and the deconstructionists come in. So, post structuralism and deconstruction are really synonymous terms. They pretty much mean the same thing. And they both grew up in response to structuralism. So, just like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, after we had formalism for a while, we ended up getting reader response theory, right? People got kind of sick of never talking about readers, never talking about the effects on readers because the formalists didn't care about that. So eventually we created reader response, which was more about foregrounding the reading experience and how readers felt and how readers were impacted. So a similar thing happens here. After structuralism is around for a while as a school of literary criticism, you get the development of what we commonly just think of as post-structuralism, what comes after structuralism. So it's some of the same guys that were involved in French structuralism. Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Foucault. A lot of these guys sort of evolved. They kind of migrated away from that traditional structuralist approach, and they started thinking more about what comes next. So, unlike the traditional structuralists, they weren't so interested in strictly grammatical features. More like us, they were more than willing to consider what we might call literary features or elements. But they're still very interested in the relationships between words and their meanings, right? Signifier and signified. And they also kind of accept this basic idea that you can look at a literary text as like a sentence in a longer paragraph, right? You can break that text down just like you can break down an individual sentence, right? There's going to be multiple words within that sentence, individual punctuation signs, right? So they sort of understood it in the same way, where you could kind of approach a literary text and sort of break it down or diagram it the same way that you would an individual sentence. However, where they differed from the old school structuralists is that, the structuralists were always looking for some kind of order, some kind of structure that would eventually be able to communicate a stable meaning. But the deconstructionists were like, yeah, we don't think that always really happens. They argued that texts often were very messy. Literary texts were often messy, and there wasn't always a clear meaning. And even if there was, sometimes that meaning might refute itself. Sometimes a text might deconstruct itself, like literally take itself apart and reveal that what it seemed to mean, it does not actually mean. So their whole thing was, texts often deconstruct their meaning. And meanings are not stable. They don't necessarily stay the same throughout time, and they're not always identifiable for everyone. So they really rejected the notion that literary text could always lead us to stable language structures. They argued that because language is unstable, that means literary texts are also unstable. Now, sometimes post-structuralism gets kind of a bad name. It can really irritate some students because there's kind of this, I think, misconception that post-structuralists were like, hey, there's limitless meaning. There is no meaning. Don't worry about finding meaning. So some people think that's basically saying, there's no point to interpret. There's no point in really doing literary study because who the hell knows? But that's not really what they're getting at. They're just saying texts are in flux. They change, and a lot of their meaning might be considered provisional or like tentative. It is subject to change. And again, if we go back to that structuralist idea that the relationship between the signifier and what the actual meaning is kind of arbitrary, then we can see that there really is a lot of different potential meanings, right? If there's no one set like linkage between a signifier and then what that signifier is supposed to mean. Again, if we just think about the multitude of different languages out there, a lot of different ways to understand a tree, right? There's not just one way to describe a tree. There's not just one word, there's not just one sign that can signify that particular meaning. There's almost an unlimited number of different words, different sounds that could potentially mean tree. So for the post-structuralist, that means that there really could be sort of an indefinite number of potential meanings with a text. So, yes, they're more so than like looking for meaning. We might think about them as taking meaning apart. And they like to show contradictions within texts. They even reject the basic notion that language can have a stable, unchanging meaning. They're like, just the nature of language pretty much makes that impossible. So, again, this leads them to the basic conclusion that there is no one absolute meaning. Very much a rejection of the formalists. Remember who said, if you're doing the right kind of close reading, you'll arrive at the one true interpretation of a text. The post-structuralists said, that's ridiculous. There is no absolute meaning. It's always changing. It's always moving. And like I said, this does strike some people as annoying and maybe even kind of like anarchy. Like if there's limitless meaning, then how do we know what we're supposed to be doing? So that is a valid question, and they sort of answered that in their own way. This one guy, Derrida, who was a very prominent French scholar, critic, talked a lot about this. And he sort of recognized that it was frustrating. But he argued that really what language does, particularly a lot of languages in the Western world, is that they restrict meaning. And again, think about this, and I think you'll agree to some extent that really is part of what language does, right? Language helps to order meaning by restricting meaning. So yes, it could become chaotic and very much anarchy if like any word we wanted could mean tree, right? So part of what language is a system of rules that tells us what we can and can't do, right? So our language system is telling us that TREE means tree. SAM does not mean tree. If I try to tell people that the word Sam means tree, I'm going to be told that I'm wrong. I can't do that, right? My language system does not allow me to make that change. I can't just replace tree with a different sign that can have the same meaning. I can't do that, not as an individual, or at least not if I want other people to understand me. If I want to remain intelligible to other members of my language community, I have to stick to the rules. I have to use the word that's been agreed upon. The word that we have all learned means what tree means, right? So that's what Derrida's saying. He's like, language restricts us. Language actually restricts our freedom to a certain extent. It restricts our options, right? Because in reality, language could be limitless. There are limitless possibilities when it comes to language, but we have to follow the rules of our particular language system. But again, we know that those rules are not natural. They're not the only rules, because the rules of English are not the same as the rules of French. So we know that there's another way of doing it, but we have to follow the rules of our language system, whatever system we are operating in at that given time. And of course, whatever system our audience belongs to. So if you're writing in English for an English language audience, you have to follow the rules of English when it comes to the words that you use and the meanings that they have. You might understand other languages, but you can't shift to those other language rules if you want to remain intelligible to your English language readers. Right? So I think we can agree that, yeah, language restricts us. Maybe we say, well, that's necessary, right? That's a good thing because we don't want limitless possibilities. But Derrida just points out that a lot of what we struggle with when we sort of deconstruct meaning or deconstruct words is it can be a little scary to realize that our language system can be disposed of. Like, our language system is not the only one. And it's not necessarily 100% right or better than other language systems. It's just a system. There are many systems, right? And they're important. People use them and need them, but they're not the end all be all. And they're not always going to mean exactly what we want them to mean. Because in some cases, language might fail. Language might not be able to communicate a particular idea. There might be certain limitations of language that we also encounter when we're studying literature. But then Derrida says, yeah, it's true that language restricts us, but there's really no escape. As he famously puts it, there's no getting outside of language. So he kind of deconstructs his own argument. And he's like, yeah, even as I make this argument, I am bound, because he's writing in French, he's saying, I am bound by the rules of my language system. Even as I point out the limitations of my language system, I can't escape it. I'm still writing in French. I'm still speaking French to other members of the French language community. So he's like, even if you know the problem, you can't really get away from it because there's no escaping language, which is an important thing to remember. Humans can never escape language if we want to communicate with other humans. There's no getting outside of it. So I don't know where that really leaves us, but just understanding the limitations while still working within those limitations is kind of what Derrida is getting at. All right, so let's jump to the examples of this kind of linguistic approach using structuralism or post-structuralism. Let's look at the examples with To His Coy Mistress and Frankenstein. So if you turn to page 183, you can see them using structuralism and post-structuralism to take a look at Marvell's poem, which we should be very familiar with by now. So they are deconstructing the poem. What does that mean? Well, they're just using a post-structuralist approach. All right. They are looking for patterns and structures of language, but then they're interested in how the meaning sort of contradicts itself or kind of destroys itself, if you want to think of deconstruction that way. Like, to literally deconstruct something is to take it apart, to disassemble it, right? So that's kind of what they're saying is happening in this poem with some of the key ideas that the speaker is discussing. So they argue that the poem is deconstructing the speaker's real object or the speaker's real topic, which is love. Now, even that's debatable, but definitely a relationship, a romantic relationship, that is what the speaker is striving for, right? That is the goal or the object that the speaker is pursuing. So if we think about it that way, and I think we would all agree that is what the speaker is after, we can notice some of the ways that idea, love, a romantic relationship, sort of gets deconstructed over the course of the poem. It gets taken apart. It sort of gets contradicted. And the meaning that we start with, we don't really end with it in the same way. So this kind of makes sense, right? And you guys pointed this out. A lot of you pointed this out in your practice close reading. You talked about how the tone shifts in the poem. And this is a pretty common observation that most readers make. We start with kind of a playful, wistful, very admiring tone, and then it shifts. It becomes something very different, especially with some of the imagery and figurative language that the speaker starts to use. And a lot of you guys pointed this out. We get imagery that really makes us think about death. He starts really almost like issuing threats to the object of his affection, saying, hey, we don't have much time. You better hurry up. You're going to die a virgin. What's the point? What a waste. So we notice this. He becomes more insistent, a little bit less romantic, maybe a little bit less kind as the poem moves on. But that's pretty much the same thing that they're pointing out, just expressed in a different way. That is what you guys are noticing in that tonal shift. That is the love being deconstructed. That is the main idea of the poem sort of falling apart or sort of getting contradicted as the speaker becomes perhaps more impatient, more insistent, or just more overtly sexual, or perhaps more pushy, if we think of it that way. So also the speaker deconstructs the woman's body. And you guys can go back to the poem and really look at the examples of this. He starts isolating particular physical features, right? When he's talking about wanting to admire her and how if they had nothing but time, he would be fine just admiring her forever. So he starts focusing on specific physical traits that he really admires, that he really likes. So in that way, he's almost deconstructing the woman. He's really reducing her to her individual physical qualities. And we might notice that aside from her being coy, he doesn't really talk very much about her personality, her other qualities. He's mostly just focused on the physical. So one way to deconstruct the text, a very simple way, would be to say, he's arguing that he wants love and a sort of romantic union, but really he just wants a physical relationship. And that's revealed by the way he deconstructs the woman. And in the same way, this lofty idea of love really gets taken apart. It gets deconstructed or contradicted until we just end up with a physical relationship that maybe doesn't really have much of an emotional component, or at least that seems like what he might actually want. So that's how they're deconstructing it. It can be a little bit of a tricky concept, but again, just think about taking the text apart and again, showing that the meaning that the text seems to have. This guy really likes this woman. He wants to be with her, right? We usually accept that meaning, but maybe after we deconstruct the text, we end up saying, actually, that meaning is not stable. That meaning is not clear. Maybe we don't think he actually has any love or high regard for her. He might just have a certain level of physical attraction, which is very different from what he started out sort of, talking about. So that's one way to deconstruct. Another thing we can consider would be, and they talk about this in the analysis, we get this fantastic set of images, right? And there's really not much realism connected to those images. None of this is very realistic, right? So you guys saw some of this, right? The hyperbole, right? The speaker is making references to the Bible and different rivers and different places that are far away from where he and this woman actually are. Right? So all these images, all of these different words, they're not really connected to reality. So the idea here is that this entire poem exists purely in the realm of language. It's just words, literally. There's no actual reality that the words can represent. And this is true. I think we can see this. As some of you even pointed out, we don't know how well the speaker knows the woman. We don't know if the woman has any interest in the speaker, right? So there's no real concrete reality that we can refer back to. We don't know. We don't know enough about the speaker. We don't know very much about the woman. And we know that almost everything the speaker is talking about is either a metaphor, hyperbole, maybe both. It's a symbol, it's imagery. None of it's realistic, right? So they're making the point that the whole poem exists in the realm of language, which makes it really good for a structuralist or post-structuralist analysis, because it's all language, right? There's nothing outside of the language that we can even really talk about in this poem. The whole poem exists within a language system, right? So that's a little bit more of a structuralist move. A post-structuralist move would be to deconstruct the meaning of the poem, or to even think about the play on words. They mentioned that a lot of the words have double meanings. So they might have a literal meaning and then a figurative meaning. Or they might mean one thing in like popular usage and then they might have another meaning. And as the poem moves on, some of those words with double meanings are used to communicate stuff pertaining to sex or physical relationships. Again, not necessarily what we might start with when we're thinking about admiring, love, and a relationship. So a lot of the double meanings of words show that the speaker is actually being sort of graphic and sort of vulgar with his language, particularly later in the poem, which sort of blows apart the intended meaning. He's trying to persuade the woman to do what he wants, but he's perhaps getting progressively more sort of hostile, vulgar, maybe even somewhat violent in terms of the language and the meaning that he's expressing. So this idea that the language only addresses other language, we can deconstruct the meaning of the poem, and we can end up with a very different reading than the reading that we might have gotten or the interpretation that we might have gotten from a formalist approach, right? So again, not so much looking for the meaning, but deconstructing the meaning and thinking about how language is working. And in this poem, the poem is nothing but language. So there's a lot of stuff we could do there with signifiers, individual words, what they mean, and then we can deconstruct what the speaker is really saying and get to what we might think of as the real truth, right? Which might be a little bit subversive. It's a little bit surprising, perhaps, compared to where we started, right? And that's often what post-structuralism will do for us. And then finally, the example of Frankenstein on page 186. I'll keep this brief, but they are talking about different discourses. There are 3 competing discourses in Frankenstein. We've already said that. There are 3 different narrators, right? There's Victor, there's the creature, and then there's Walton, who we start and end with. So they're referring to those different points of view, those different narratives within the novel as different discourses, right? So they're all written by Shelley, but they're all spoken by different characters. So we can think more about those individual discourses. What are they doing? How do they clash? Again, post-structuralists are looking at ways that language often clashes with itself. It can be contradicting. It can refute itself. Think about Victor's narrative compared to the creature's narrative. They don't agree, right? They don't agree. Their narratives are in competition. They're against one another. They're not working together, right? So that is a way to approach the novel. Think about these different discourses from the different narrators and how they're not really harmonious. And then they get into some larger questions like who is really talking, right? And who are they talking to? Right? Even questions of readers and audience is kind of complicated, right? Who is the receiver, right? So if Victor is the sender, who exactly is the receiver, right? And then think about the different potential audience for the creature. Then think about Walton. Walton is writing his letters to his sister. Walton actually has a very clear receiver. The creature and Victor, not so much. Who are they writing to? Right? Who is Victor telling his story to? And how does Victor's story contradict or clash with the creature's story? So all of that's fair game if you're doing this kind of, structuralist or post-structuralist analysis. And they make the argument that the creature is trying to understand culture, trying to discover how humans are largely through language. Think about when he learns to speak French by listening to that family, right? He finds the books in the woods. He reads them. That's how he learns, right? He learns through language, largely in isolation because nobody will hang out with him. So he learns by listening and reading, right? The semantic event and the phonetic event. He hears language and he reads language, and he hopes that language will allow him to understand people. But it doesn't, right? He's still surprised and disappointed by how people treat him. So, again, this shows the limitations of language. Also, we have a lot of crisscrossing of language. Think about that bizarre scene at the old guy's cabin, right? An old family speaking French in a German speaking area of Switzerland. According to some critics, that's probably where we were at that point. And then we know that the son of the old blind guy, his fiance is from Turkey, and she's learning French at the same time that the creature is learning French. So we have different languages being acquired by different characters at different times. And the languages are not all working together. They're not all harmonious. They are not all on the same page. So we see the limitations of language. We can study the different discourses and think about how they're manipulating different elements, how they're clashing, how they're fighting amongst themselves. And we can also sort of deconstruct a lot of the typical meanings that we find here. And one interesting point, and I'll finish with this, they say that, in a lot of the movie adaptations, the creature doesn't really say a whole lot, right? The creature is often inarticulate. In a lot of movie versions, the creature does not have language. But in the book, you guys know, in the book, the creature talks a lot. The creature does possess language, right? So that creates a whole nother discourse. And think about what a weird discourse that is. What a weird particular usage of language it is for a monster that was made out of dead people by a mad scientist. Think about how different that discourse is from Victor's or from a more typical human discourse. So there's just a lot you can do by approaching that text on the level of linguistics, these different language systems, and what they're doing. So you can find meaning, but you can also deconstruct meaning. That's what these linguistic approaches give us a chance to do. So I want you guys to try these on for size this week. I don't expect you to be experts. Don't worry if you have a few missteps. It's just about trying. It's about putting forth the effort, and it's just practice. Okay, so I'll give you a prompt to respond to. I'll give you some new texts, and we can try either a structuralist or a post-structuralist reading. You can even do a combination of the two, because that's what these examples are really showing. All right, so let me know if you have any issues, and otherwise I will see you next week.